they must cry, cry, cry. Oh, they blues away. Cry, cry, cry. Their blues away. Her name was Sue, yes. His name was Earl. His love was Lorraine. She's a wonderful girl, but they must cry, cry, cry. Oh, they blues away. They blues away. Love will make you happy, and love will make you cry. Love will make the tears fall when your lover says goodbye, and then you'll cry, cry, cry. Oh, your blues away. This story ends, yes, it was no lie. Names have been changed, dear, to protect you and I, but we must cry, cry, cry. Oh, our blues away. We must cry.
I don't even know where to begin because I actually did a whole bunch of things. But this is a very controversial book because this book starts to talk about who was actually selling the slaves, who were the merchants, who were the one with the ships, who were doing all the things that we weren't told. And it was connected to the tiny hats, and the tiny hats were the merchants. And this book talks about how all the plantations were ran by the tiny hats. They owned all of the plantations, and they were controlling the entire industry. They were kicked out of all these different countries because this is the stuff that they were doing. So this is a really deep book. And it talks about even all the clothing that people buy. You know, you go to all the different clothing that people purchase, all the department stores people shop at. All these different divisions are all owned by the tiny hats. And so let me get into this. So these are pictures. This one goes through each picture. And it shows all the newspapers of the tiny hats owning the newspapers and then putting these in there as advertisements for selling slaves. And they owned all the newspapers. So every single newspaper was owned in the 1800s to the 1850s to the 1900s, all by the tiny hats. And they had all these ads in the newspapers where they were selling these slaves. And when a slave ran away, they actually would put up an ad to get them back. So that's really important for people to kind of understand all of this whole thing. And also the whole term layaway came from the tiny hats. They were putting slaves on layaway, so the payment system came from the tiny hats, and they used that with slaves, and they would put slaves on layaway. This is nuts. Like, this book is mind-blowing when you go through it, because so many things I was not taught in school, in the Rockefeller Rothschild school. That's what it is. So it goes into, let me go into some more. Okay, so they believed, the tiny hats believed, that since they were chosen by God, that they deserved to do this. So they deserved to take people from another country, sell them, extort them, and basically make money off of them. And they believed that since they were the chosen people, that's what they told themselves, that they were allowed to do that. So think about that, okay? Think about that. And somebody just said the Ashkenazis. Yes, you get into this, you get into the Charzarians, you get into the Phoenicians, you get into the Karzarians. They have lots of names. They have changed their names many times to fit in. That's what they have done. They've changed their names many, many, many times to fit in. So you go through all these different advertisements. I mean, this book is nuts, the amount of advertisements in newspapers, okay? So this is the thing. They create division amongst us, right? So the tiny hats create division amongst us with the newspaper, and then they blame it on each other, me and you, right? Everybody who's doing it. But in reality, they're the ones with the newspaper. They're the ones making the ads. They're the ones selling the product, right? Because they're trying to sell the product. That's the tiny hats. And this is crazy too, because this goes into the ships owned by the tiny hats right here. So they owned all the slave ships. And it's interesting because when Christopher Columbus came over here, he came over here with 300,000 tiny hats. And then they brought the slavery over to the country. And you realize that Christopher Columbus and those people were kicked out of the country. They kicked them out of the country, and then they came to America, which was the New World, to set up their whole new business. That's what actually took place. So when they say Christopher Columbus came over and sailed ocean blue, yeah, Christopher Columbus was a tiny hat who came over with 300,000 other ones who then started the slave trade and started screwing everybody and taking over the country. 1492. So this stuff goes way back, I've realized. Like, our country has been compromised for a long period of time. And it's just, like I said, they use division. This is crazy too. So this is the Congregation of Tiny Hats in 1760 in Newport right here, okay? And if you notice down on the bottom there, it says Monsanto. That's the last name. That's the last name. So you kind of understand, this is the slave ships. They had handcuffs and hardware and all types of bondage. They had the people pinned, so they were selling them. I found out that Charleston, South Carolina, was where the tiny hats gathered, right there, okay? So the tiny hats were gathered in Charleston, South Carolina in 1825. That's where they started off before they went to New York City. They were actually in Charleston. And this was their mart where they would sell the slaves. They owned the marts, and they owned the merchant ships, and they owned every single thing, and they were all based out of Charleston, South Carolina. So when you look at Charleston, South Carolina, and they start telling you everything about slavery, what they forgot to tell you is about the tiny hats who were involved in that transaction and the ones who were doing it all. And it's crazy. Like, this book is just mind-blowing. And then all the plantations of South Carolina right there, all owned by the tiny hats. That's what it is. This book is nuts, is what it is. This book is completely crazy. And it just blew my mind because, like I said, I was never taught any of this in school. You know, why was this left out? Oh, because they wanted to create division amongst us. That's what it was. And here's the thing is, when slaves would run away, right here, they would put up rewards. So the tiny hats would put up rewards to try to get them back. That's what the tiny hats were doing. They were putting up newspaper articles because they own the newspaper to try to say that they need to get the slaves back. I mean, this is diabolical is what it is. And that's why I'm trying to put this in here so that people can see this. And I just want people to see this because this book just blew my mind. Because once again, it's something that you're not taught, right? They teach us to fight with one another. They teach us to have these, the race wars and division and this versus this. In reality, the tiny hats are the ones orchestrating all the nonsense the entire time. So here's more rewards, and that's Isaac Moses right there. You see that name? Isaac Moses right there. Tiny hat having rewards for if their slaves ran away. And it was interesting because when you get into the tiny hats, they weren't for abolishing slavery because they were owning the slaves. They were owning the slaves. And what's even crazier is there was a man who was, there was this other fellow right here who wrote another book, and he was part of the synagogue, and he showed that they were all owning the slaves. Look at that. So that's why we have to address this topic, because there's a part that's been left out. And when you leave out a part of the story, you need to be able to kind of teach the truth. And that's why we're talking about it today. That's what it is. So, and that's why, like I said, your school programming, Rockefellers, Rothschilds, they've been teaching you a bunch of nonsense. And we're kind of deprogramming that with this little one today. Let me go into here. So then we get into the cotton picking and the tiny hats. They own the cotton industry. So they own the department stores. They own the clothing stores. They own all of the cotton. This is going back to the Lehman Brothers. And during that time, you're going back to the Civil War, 1901. They've owned the cotton industry since that. Then you have the Lehman Brothers as well, some of the largest slave traders. And this is all, like I said, left out of the story. You get into all the cotton plantations and you find the tiny hats. Largest holders of slaves. Oh yeah, this is another crazy one. You get into who runs the police. Oh, this gets deep, right? Okay, so the tiny hats own the slaves, right? And then they also own the police. Let me read you some of the police's names. Louis Gomez, Eliezer, Solomon, Goldsmith, Moses, Marx, Moses Jr., and Levi, or Levy. So the tiny hats had the merchant ships. They were the auctioneers of the slaves. They had all the slave control, all the ships. They controlled it all. They controlled it all over the world. They also owned the police so that in case the slaves ran away, the tiny hats could track them down. This is why I say this stuff is so important for people to understand, and this is why books like this show a completely different story. And once again, you're not going to hear this side of the history because the school system isn't going to teach any of this because the school system's owned by the same people. Then we move into people who actually spoke up about it. This was a fellow who spoke up about it, so people are aware. There's actually two fellows right here. This was Reverend Dr. Leonard Barrett, and he actually spoke up about the whole thing with slavery and the tiny hats. And then there was also Rabbi Dr. Bertram Korn. And actually, he's the one who wrote this book, I found out. It was so funny because I bought this book because I wanted to look into this topic, and he was one of the two people who spoke up to talking about how slavery was controlled by the tiny hats. There were only two people who actually spoke up because this industry runs so deep. Think of all these files that have been released lately. Remember the whole Department of Justice, and they said there's no files, whatever? Guess who ties that back to? Guess who ties that back to? Do you see why that is completely defended by the Department of Justice? The Department of Justice is in on that because when we got back into who owns the Department of Justice, you get into the tiny hats. And then when you get into who owns the slaves, you get into the tiny hats. So you see how all of these industries are owned by the same people. So when, yes, the files which were just released with the whole Epstein thing, now you start to understand why they're all blacked out. Because once you start connecting the names, you're going to start to understand the people who are actually doing it. And there were only two people right here who spoke up about this. There was only one American newspaper, and the tiny hats tried to boycott that newspaper. So during the 1800s, from the 1850s to the 1890s or 1900s, there was only one American newspaper. All of the newspapers were owned by the tiny hats. So if you didn't know that, that's actually what was going down. So if all the newspapers are owned by the tiny hats, okay, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about all of the racist things that used to be in newspapers right there, okay? So think about this. You used to see all these very racist things that were in the newspapers. Well, when you think about who owns the newspapers, if only one newspaper in the entire United States is owned by Americans, and that one was actually bought out by the tiny hats, then who produced all the racist content that was in the newspapers? The tiny hats. Because when the tiny hats own the entire newspaper industry, you start to understand who's making this stuff and putting it in front of the people, so that people would then respond to it. This is crazy. Like, this is just, when you think about how crazy this actually is, that the tiny hats own the slave trade. They were the merchants, they own the stores, they own the marts, they own that, then they own the newspapers, and then they own all of the information or the production that goes into the newspapers of all the racist things that used to be on there. Think of how twisted that is. Think of how twisted that actually is. And then people are seeing this stuff in the newspaper and they don't understand why they keep seeing this stuff in the newspaper, right? You're growing up in 1900s and people are seeing this in the newspaper, but that's because the tiny hats own the newspaper. So you use propaganda to divide and conquer the people, right? Because people see this and it's what happens. It creates divide and conquer. They're like, oh, this is crime, this is that, this is whatever, right? They even these headlines. Let me read you some of these, okay? Let me read you some of these headlines because that's the same exact thing. You get into all the crime headlines that are always produced into the newspaper. The tiny hats were the ones producing those headlines and putting them into the newspaper. So then people are like, oh, there's crime skyrocketing and so. Yeah, they own the newspaper. And then they created the divide and conquer tactic against all of us. We, the people, right? Because we, the people of the country, because we're all in here together, are the ones who are really getting screwed by the tiny hats. Because when you own the entire media, when you own all the newspaper, you own the radio, you own the television, you own the movies, Do you kind of see what happens? And somebody just said it's the art of war. Yes, that's exactly what this is. It's the art of war. You use the things like the newspapers and all of this against the people. And you put this propaganda out and this racist nonsense and all these other things out there so that every person is fighting because they don't know, right? Like people don't know that the tiny hats own this newspaper. So they put all of this stuff out here and then it creates divide and conquer. And then the groups of people who are in here, of all the people, of everybody who lives in America, do not unite because they see all of this stuff and then they don't unite against these Rothschilds, Lehman Brothers, Warburgs, and bankers and the people who run this system. Because they own the right side, they own the left side, they own the media, they own the politicians, they own the newspapers, the televisions, the radios, the whole thing. And then it just creates division. So then when people go to talk about it, they get attacked. That's what it is, right? You show books of things that the tiny hats were doing, and then people attack each other. They don't come together to think because the school system that they have been in 18 years has programmed them to a certain mindset. And let's just get into this one. So the whole Bolshevik Revolution. Wow, that's so crazy. Someone just commented about the Bolshevik Revolution, and I, at the exact same time, held up this pamphlet. And the Bolshevik Revolution was the tiny hats. What they did was they infiltrated the government, they took over the journalists, they took over the government, they took over all the commanders, all the people, everything else, and they used their own military against the people to take over Russia. And then once they were taking over Russia, they went into another country. For example, they went into Spain, they went into China, okay? They went into Poland as well. They went into Germany. They went into all the countries and they started taking over the countries. So you have to think about it. These Karzarian, whatever word you want to call them, connected to the tiny hats, would then go into these other countries and then take over those countries. And they would degrade the country and then take it over. And that's where this whole thing, you get into Karl Marx and the Bolsheviks, and he was connected to the synagogues and the tiny hats and all of that. And it's just absolutely crazy. Someone said, I never understood why my aunt, who just passed away at 99, always warned me about the tiny hats. Your aunt at 99 knew things. And this is the thing, when you think about our elders, they know the stuff, they know this stuff, they know the history, they lived through it. You know, they understand what's actually taking place. And until the people wake up, right? Like that's what this live is about today. It's a little intense, but that's what today is about. It's about understanding what is actually taking place. Even the stuff in Iran right now, right? What's going on with Iran? Should we break it down? Okay, so you had the first Shah, when it was Persia, who allied with Germany. And guess what they did? The United States and Great Britain and the Soviets decided, well, we can't have that. So they took him out. Then they got his son in there who favored Stalin. And then they tried to do the whole Stalin thing, and then that didn't work. And then they switched the regime again, because Stalin came in again, and then changed it again. And then here we are today, and then people are now complaining about their government, which has been infiltrated because the government has been sanctioned and taken over. And it's just bankers doing this. And it all ties back to the Bolsheviks. Like the Bolsheviks, the bankers, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Lehmans, the Loebs. It's all the same people. The people who run the Federal Reserve. That's all it is. Every single thing. They just orchestrate wars and they have people fight against each other. Then they got to bring in their bank and they got to take over their system. It's just, like, just, you know, slap. Just like that's it. Like, just wake up, people. Wake up, you know. Just wake up. And it says between the years of 1300 and 1650s, the tiny hats were expelled from England, France, Belgium, Slovakia, Austria, Holland, Spain, Lithuania, Portugal, Prussia, Italy, Bavaria, because of their charges of ritual murder. Vast hordes of tiny hats from the Khazar area of South Russia also moved into the same area with the center of the world of tiny hats. Thus, millions of tiny hats came to reside in Warsaw and the Kiev Triangle. That Ukraine right there, right? That whole Ukraine thing. You get it? Tiny hats. Right? And then you have the tiny hats believe that the Christians held them back. So guess what they did? They decided to punish the Christians. Because they said, oh, well, you're going to hold us back and not allow us to do our thing in your countries? Guess what? Well, we're going to destroy your country. And that's what they've done. And then when they didn't do that, they went into the Middle East and destabilized the Middle East. Remember the whole thing with Libya and Gaddafi and Saddam and Afghanistan and Syria? Guess what? Same exact thing. That's the exact same playbook. So first they hit the Christian countries because the Christian people were like, we're not having it. Then they move into the Middle East and they're like, guess what? Destabilize those countries. Then they moved into like Vietnam. Remember that? Vietnam, Thailand, all that. Guess what? Tiny hats. So they infiltrate each country, take over the country, destroy it from within, and then move on to the next. And they take the gold, and they take the silver, and they take the resources, and they steal it all from the people. They steal it all from the people so that the people have nothing left. Look around, people. Look at the gas prices. Look at the housing prices. Look at the food prices. This is the same stuff that took place in Germany in 1933. Everything got super expensive because the Federal Reserve, the banking system, makes things expensive. And these groups of people, the Bolsheviks and the tiny hats and the Chazarians and Khazarians, they're the ones doing it. And they wrote all the playbooks, and Japan was actually one of the countries that went against them. This is why they bombed Japan to nothing after World War II. People are like, oh, they dropped nukes. They didn't drop any nukes. They firebombed Japan until there was nothing left. That's all it is. And people hopefully are waking up, because I see it on social media and I think people are waking up.